space, there's been over $20 billion of investments. Miko's company itself has invested over 100 million, right? So it's very, very qualified to talk about the future of Web3 gaming. I think there's some really, really cool things that are happening in the space. So really look forward to seeing what Miko has to share. So with that, he's going to deliver the final keynote and the wrap up. So over to you, Miko, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, Miko, we can.
Okay, great. I'm excited to be here. Is for the players to not change their strategy, right? So what happens is that games enter into these states where they just become rigid, right? So everyone starts behaving the same way and it gets stuck, right? So the games get stuck, right? So the thing that's really interesting is, from a venture investor perspective, how do we invest in something like an OpenSea? How do we invest in Yield Guild Games, 1inch, Credo Networks, like a number of unicorns, I think about 8 in our Fund 1, right? So we really think about the future and we think about disruption, right? So we're very interested because obviously disrupting what, right? So the disruption really has to do with this idea of the Nash equilibrium, because what you're disrupting is you're disrupting a game that has become effectively stuck, right? So it's a game that, where everybody kind of is playing the same and nobody's changing, right? So the thing that we find within long-standing Nash equilibria is we find that they become sub-optimized. So I just, and that's what invites disruption, right? Which is that network states become stuck in things that are inefficient and they're not positive, right? So I just wanted to set the stage in order to talk about Web3 gaming, because I think Web3 gaming, it's quite important to understand what is being disrupted, why it's being disrupted, and who's kind of interested in this disruption. So I think the first thing to understand is that, I think that the gamers don't have a problem, right? So I think that's a really important thing. So I think a lot of people talk about Web3 gaming and they're like, oh, why does the gamer care about Web3 gaming? So to be honest, like the gamer doesn't care, right? So what I wanted to characterize for you is the following, right? Which is that, what is the difference between Web2 gaming and Web3 gaming? Like why is Web3 gaming different? So to me, the simplest, most succinct way to describe this will be as follows, which is in Web2, the game owns the players. And in Web3, the players own the game, right? So the thing that's very interesting about ownership is that people who've never had ownership don't thirst for ownership. They just have no idea what it's like, right? Now, once given ownership, then people will not surrender that, right? So in a sense, it's this irreversible direction and reorganization of a market. But if the gamers don't care about it, then how does this transition in the Nash equilibrium come to pass? What's the mechanism through which the disruption occurs, right? So there's a lot of really interesting vectors, right? Obviously, there's many, many vectors, right? Because one of the things we do as investors is we try not to invest in linear, obvious, single vector disruption, right? So for example, if you're investing in AI, right? If you're like, oh, AI is big, right? So then the knee-jerk reaction is just to, throw checks into AI companies, right? But we don't look at the world this way. We actually look at what are the forces that can disrupt something that is a Nash equilibria, and we look for Nash equilibria that are very, very poorly assembled, that networks that are stuck in a negative condition, negative state. So I'll tell you in gaming where the problem is. The problem is not with the gamer. The gamer is not like, oh, I wish I had NFTs, right? Like no gamer is saying anything like this, right? The problem in gaming is actually the industry itself. The industry itself is desperately broken and it's stuck in a Nash equilibrium that's exceedingly kind of toxic, right? And one of the things that happens in the game industry is this concept of crunch, right? And crunch is basically the many, many kind of 20-hour workdays that game developers and designers put in right before the game ships, right? So it's really, really this terrible do or die, right? So the thing that I think is fascinating about this tendency in the industry is that the industry easily can accept do or die. They can accept do or die. What they cannot accept is they cannot accept do and die, right? So people are working very hard to ship games, and that this working hard actually culminates in cancellation, right? And so what happens is that the current structure of financing for the game industry is effectively driven by suits. So the suits show up with an Excel spreadsheet and they say, hey, based on your numbers, you 700 people working on this game, you can all go home because you're all fired. We cancel the game, it's over. Nobody wants your game, right? So if you look at the impact of Web3, the thing that becomes interesting is that the people deciding the fate of a game are not necessarily devoid of suits. There will be suits there, right? But I think that the suits are really just purely financial investors. But you're going to see more of people who are the gamers, and the gamers are investing in the game. So what are the kind of vectors and conditions under which this transformation can occur, right? So what are the preconditions? So the first precondition is that you have a suboptimal Nash equilibrium, right? That's a precondition for disruption because it wants to be disrupted, right? Like the way things are now are unacceptable. So right now they're unacceptable to the people working in the game industry, which is the game. If there's a wonderful book called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, right? So if you read this book, it documents the history of the game industry, and it does document a lot of winners. So it documents like wonderful games, Stardew Valley, or, all of these kind of famous indie games, hit games, mega games. But the issue there is that even the winners kind of ended up going through hell in order to ship, right? So it's a very, very troubled, difficult industry, right? The thing that I think is brutal are the cancellations, right? So what I really want to say is that it's an industry that wants to change and that it's kind of desperate for change, right? But the question becomes, what are the catalysts that can help with the transformation of this industry? I think one of the catalysts is obviously we're seeing a bull bear cycle within crypto. So crypto as an asset class has a natural bull bear cycle. It has hyper bull, hyper bear, right? And we're seeing things like the emergence of this Bitcoin halving interval. So we're less than 250 days away from the mid-April halving, right? Bitcoin supply halving, it's about every 4 years, right? So the excitement around something like this as a catalyst, obviously we're seeing new entrants like BlackRock who are submitting for a spot ETF on Bitcoin, right? So, obviously, Bitcoin doesn't need all the attention, but rather that most cryptographic assets tend to price correlate to Bitcoin, right? So that means that if we see a Bitcoin blow off top, we'll see an Ethereum blow off top, we'll see other blow off tops, right? So the thing that's interesting generationally is that when you go back to the era of like baby boomers, the baby boomers actually, when they got rich, they would become producers for movies, right? So I think this new younger generation that's going to profit off of this extreme volatility within the crypto market, they will probably produce games, right? So the thing that I think, it may be kicking off a cycle of vitality for this style of game. One of the things that we are seeing is with $7.6 billion of investment in Web3 gaming, including examples like, A16Z invested $40 million into Hilmar's CCP Games, right, which is the creator of EVE Online, right? And Hilmar said something very entertaining. He said, "My job is to make games that are more meaningful than real life." Right. So that's his job. That's how he sees his job. Right. And so when you go back into this idea of what is a metaverse, I think that a metaverse is basically a fictitious land that gets not only more meaning, but then it gets more value than reality itself. So, if you read Herman Narula's book, Virtual Societies, you'll know that he actually thinks that the ancient Egyptians had their own metaverse. Now, he's not some kind of crackpot that thinks UFO aliens gave them Oculus headsets. Like the ancient Egyptians did not have much digital technology, right? But they did have symbols. in the form of hieroglyphics, right? So they had language and they had the ability to create a fictitious word. I mean, in our view is that it was fictitious, right? Which is animal head gods, right? But that the animal head god story was so powerful and so valuable that it caused them to do things like erect giant pyramids, right? So were these stories valued highly? Yes, of course they were valued very highly, right? So the idea that humans are able to invent stories, value the stories, and value the content of the stories more than they value even their daily physical experiences, like that's clear, right? So from this vantage point, we think this is a very important trend. But I talked about not being obvious with respect to things like AI. But like when you think about AI is going to disrupt the apple cart. I think AI will destroy Web 2. I think that it will do so by generating fake humans. So there will be billions of fake humans. I think there will be fake content, right? So deep fake content, right? So there's going to be billions of deep fake contents. And then basically nobody is going to know it, whether anything is real or not on the internet, right? But further, the impact of AI is actually going to create a situation where jobs will be lost en masse. So we're going to see massive scale job loss. But here's a fascinating industry, right? Which is that on the plus side, it will also impact productivity, which is very, very exciting, right? So if you look at what Kathy Woods has done in terms of her analytics on economic development, one of the really fascinating things is that if you can get a 10x multiplier on productivity of individual workers, you can actually afford as an economy to decrease your workforce. So then the question is, what do all the people do? So the thing that becomes really interesting is that the people can actually join the entertainment industry, because the entertainment industry is actually scalable. And what I mean by it's scalable is if you have 4 billion humans sitting around with nothing to do, and yet we have enough robotics and automation to deliver food and deliver energy and deliver housing, deliver everything they need, then what will happen is the entertainment industry will expand by several orders of magnitude, right? And people will not just be in the business of consuming entertainment, but they'll be also in the business of producing entertainment, and people will want more and more entertainment, right? So, I mean, if you study Microsoft, if you look at what Microsoft is doing, well, they're throwing $1 billion into OpenAI, right? And then they're throwing tens of billions of dollars into Activision Blizzard, right? And they're throwing $0 into HoloLens VR headsets, right? So it's very interesting to watch their footwork as a company, because what they seem to believe is they seem to believe in a future that I'm describing, right? Which is they seem to believe in a future where AI has had a smashing impact, right? And when you look at the characters around OpenAI, right, obviously, when you look at, what Sam has been doing with WorldCoin, right? Like WorldCoin is very much this mood of kind of like Sybil resistance, which is fake humans, right? What do you do when all the humans are fake? Well, it's like, okay, we need this. I think Thomas Pan said it nicely, which is proof of humanness, right? So Sybil resistance, documented proof of humanness. I don't think it's going to be these eyeball-shaped retina scan type of proofs. I think there'll be wonderful, trusted partners like Apple who are doing kind of Face ID type technology with, LiDAR and all, so there's definitely like biometrics is going to be there, but we already have very, very robust and ubiquitous biometrics providers, including on the Android platform. So I would say the following, right, which is that biometrics and proof of humanness will be important. And we are going to see the emergence of some kind of a universal basic income. I think the first privatized version of which we saw with Axie Infinity, and we saw that with Yield Guild Games, which is essentially a labor union for the metaverse that begins to aggregate a universal basic income where the proof of humanness is the ability to play a Pokemon style game, right? Now, is this a sufficient proof? Well, it's possible that you could create a botnet that plays this Pokemon style game, in which case you now have kind of bought to earn, right? So now you have a really clear mechanism for extracting value out of this network, right? So it's not optimal. And I think obviously there's some very weird incentives there. Like if you look at Twitter, it's incentivized botnets, right? If you look at the number of Elon Musk followers that have had 0 posts and 0 followers, it's in the many millions, right? So like Twitter is an incentivized botnet. And I believe that also we will see things like Axie Infinity actually incentivizes a botnet as a function of having user growth, right? So that look at our huge user growth, right? And so the point that I'm trying to make is that, you know, we do need to work on our incentive design in Web3. But what I really just wanted to do is talk about this from the broader view of asset tokenization, right? Which is that in the big picture, you know, asset tokenization and decentralization are the beating heart and the battlefield for Web3, right? Because Web2 providers know they're in trouble, right? Elon Musk doesn't want to run a company called Twitter. He wants to run one called X, right? Zuckerberg doesn't want to run a company called Facebook. He wants to run one called Meta. Dorsey doesn't want to run Twitter. He wants to run Block, right? So everyone's running away. The Web2 people are running away from their creations, right? Web2 is basically over, right? And obviously things like privacy regulation are starting to drive kind of Web3 themes. But, you know, Elon Musk is going to integrate some form of payments into X, the Everything app. He thinks it's going to be like WhatsApp in China, right? But my point is he doesn't necessarily need blockchain, right? He's got end-to-end encryption on DMs, right? So he's definitely stealing all the ideas from Web3, right? But I think that the core and the last bastion of the ethos of Web3 is decentralized ownership, which is really made possible through tokenization, you know, and it's really made possible through this kind of network of permissionless, decentralized services and decentralized finance, right? With full transparency, automated liquidation, all of the kind of beautiful code is law paradigms that we can all benefit from, right? So I think really like the idea that we can sort of wholesale replace the inefficient, intransparent rails of our global financial system is in some ways a precondition for you know, really capturing the value of these open internet Web3 protocols, right? So I would say that, you know, the thing that I think is very exciting about this idea of tokenization is that the next wave really does have to do with regulated DeFi. It has to do with KYC and KYB counterparties. It has to do with real world assets, although I'm cautious about using that term because I believe that real world assets can be split into ultra high quality real world assets, right? Which will be regulated stable coins, government treasuries, right? Regulated government treasuries, right? You know, because the problem with all real world assets is that they suffer from the Brooklyn Bridge problem, right? Which is that I can sell you the Brooklyn Bridge token, you know, it only costs $1 million. It's a great deal because the Brooklyn Bridge is obviously worth much more, but obviously I don't own the Brooklyn Bridge, right? So that's a problem, right? So it requires an oracle. So it requires an off-chain proof, right? So in essence, the quality of a real world asset is dependent on the quality of the oracle, right? So really we're back outside of code being law because there's no code that can actually look off-chain and guarantee that it's faithfully reporting reality, right? So that's a problem, right? So then you're reduced to things like staking and slashing, right? So, but if you go back to law is law, right, then you don't need code as law, and that means regulators, right? So I think that regulators will come in on high quality assets, and that's how we will replace a lot of the financial infrastructure of the planet and use blockchain rails, right? Which is we will have regulation, we will have regulators, we will have clear laws. For example, in Europe, we're going to see Miko regulation take place. We're going to see leadership from countries like France. So we're definitely going to see really interesting kinds of like new experiments in the broader spectrum of real world assets and what I kind of jokingly refer to as fake world assets, right? Which is, you know, and I like to call them fake world assets, the biggest of which is Bitcoin, right? So, you know, it's so I would say this is that, you know, if you're to kind of have any sort of take homes from this talk, I definitely would want you to contemplate these massive social, economic, and technological disruption factors that are coming. But I think to do so from potentially a hopeful and optimistic lens, right? Because if you really look at this from the perspective of transformation, technology transformation, right? The world that we look for may have massive job disruption through AI, but it will also have massive productivity increases. And I think the critical lever becomes whether we can deploy enough abundant clean energy to basically take care of what looks like a peak of 10 billion humans on the earth, right? Because if we can take care of the people on the earth, then the gaming industry becomes very large. So that, and governments get involved in gaming, right? And entertainment, right? Because governments will need people to be employed. They'll need to collect taxes. They're going to need to, make changes. So this is really more of the optimistic future that I'd like to paint. I know that there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. And, but I do think that builders are inherently optimistic people, because otherwise they would just stop building, right? They would just be depressed and do nothing. So, I think for us, we just look for the best builders. We look for them at the earliest stages, and we try to support them through thick and thin. So that's a little bit about myself, vision, a little bit about Web3 gaming in the future, and I think the future of tokenization. So thank you.
Awesome. That was bravo. That was brilliant. Two questions for you, Miko. Two not related, unrelated questions. One, in the play to earn world, does it make sense for games to pay the rewards or the earnings in fiat, or will it be better off, paying in like a crypto? And the second question is the US a saturated market, and the bigger growth going to come from, like, say, India, China, or Nigeria, some of these high population, countries, right? So I was very curious to know your thoughts on those two.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is really about whether play to earn should be kind of compensated or remunerated within the crypto or within fiat currency. So I think one of the things that's very, very important to understand is kind of Gen 1 play to earn. And in fact, the entire paradigm of playing to earn is probably limited because if you're playing to earn, it's effectively the same as DeFi, right? Which is it creates a yield chasing effect, right? And basically games that are fun succumb to games that are more kind of economic, right? And so it really becomes a game of kind of disloyal economy jumping, and basically what happens is it becomes sort of like game pumping and game dumping, right? So people just fly from game to game. They suck out as much value and they dump it for, transfer it into fiat, right? So, I think the intent of playing to earn is maybe not the best intention, right? I think in terms of the international composition, it's pretty well known that among the 3.5 to 3.7 billion global internet gamers, that the majority, 57% actually, are in Asia. So it's definitely a strongly Asian skewed sort of populace within gaming. There's certain very, very extraordinary, strange countries that maybe are not geographically or population particularly big, but have an undue impact on gaming itself. I think in things like intellectual property, I think Japan is very unusual in gaming. Obviously, with big beasts like Nintendo, globally, the sort of largest video game based movie franchise of all time, the Super Mario movie, $1 billion box office, right? Obviously, Nintendo's a giant. Obviously, Sony is a giant, right? So Sony has PlayStation, and they have a lot of really good power coming out of Japan. Obviously, we're seeing things like Breath of the Wild, Zelda, and other tremendous Japan IP franchises, right? Another Asian country that's exceedingly powerful in gaming is Korea, right? Korea probably has the top esports players within most game franchises, the birthplace of effectively esports through game titles like StarCraft and others, where Korea has become a global superpower in esports and in gaming, right? So we definitely think that there's a tremendous kind of power in the East, but we also do feel this, right? Which is that one of the genius things that Axie Infinity did kind of basically ultra rich nations who were basically buying the Axies, right? And then much more developing nations that were mostly playing, right? So it created this scholarship pattern where it connected wealthy countries to countries that are developing, through this scholarship concept, right? So that we think is a really powerful innovation. We think that this does fit the broader pattern of essentially AI being an accelerator for wealth inequality, whereas something like blockchain actually being a counterweight, right? Effectively, that what you have is you have, people who are in the first world kind of buying assets and subsidizing and then enabling the play and earning for people who are in developing geographies, right? So, we definitely see that there are really interesting constructs where developing nations can then be beneficiaries of open source financial infrastructure and the kind of radically reduced cost per transaction, not just from things like regulatory circumvention, which we think will go away, but through things like automation, right? Through things like reliability, and anti-fraud technologies, automated liquidation, transparency, much better analytics of things like liquidity shock, so when you think about stress testing banks, it's going to help to be able to see exactly what the balance sheets are and all of the holdings, right? So if you want to do risk computation, you can do it really beautifully, and if you want to liquidate them, you can do so automatically, right? So that those are all superpowers of DeFi, right? So we really feel like these are going to be really important pillars of the future of both finance as well as entertainment.
Amazing. Now, we'll end with this one question. I think you'll like this question. When I heard you talk at House of Web3 Edge and Node, right? You said how the power has shifted from the game publisher to the gamer in this Web3 world, right? And this question, I really like this question from one of the young members in the audience. He asked, what's the challenge now for both the game publishers and the developers in Web3, right?
Yeah, so the thing that I think is really amazing is that the publishers have effectively become sort of the villains of the story, right? Because they've just been the source of a lot of bad acting. And so, when you look at these grand, like, my son told me a joke, which was, why is EA the worst company in North America, right? So that was the question, right? And the answer was, because Ubisoft is in France, right? That's basically the joke, right? And so these companies have earned a lot of hatred, right? And they do so by effectively sort of betraying gamers. At GamesBeat, there was a executive from Amazon Gaming, and she said this, which I really enjoyed, is she said that intellectual property in gaming is a two-edged sword, right? Because you have to adapt the IP so that new gamers are attracted to come play, but at the same time you have to respect the super fans, right? You have to respect the IP, right? And the thing that was very shocking is what she was saying. Is she was saying, like, here's a big publisher saying you have to respect the fans, you have to respect the gamers, right? That's never been the case, right? Like, it's always been, let's just make a crappy game, let's just take the IP, slap it on top, and they'll just buy it, right? Because they're stupid, right? It's like, no, like, the gamers are not stupid, right? And basically things like review sites like Metacritic and things like Steam, like, the amount of intelligence that goes into game discovery now is really, really good. So, like, you can't just pawn off crappy games and slap IP on. Like, people aren't doing that anymore, right? The gamers have respect, the gamers have power, and the gamers, if you disrespect the IP, like, you're going to hear about it. Like the reviews will be written, you're going to get flamed, and like your thing is going to go down the tubes, right? So that the power shift is palpable, and we think that power shift is going to be, a 10 to 100 times stronger when we start to add Web3 elements, right? Because what will happen in Web3 elements is you're going to have crypto super whales that own significant chunks of these Web3 games through, just governance tokens, or through this kind of power of effectively becoming a producer, like a movie producer, right? So they're going to be these kinds of like things as a function of like a crypto blow off top, right? So you're going to have people with just excess wealth that are going to be creating stories. They're going to be creating games, not have the talent themselves to create a game, but they're going to be very strongly influential, and they're going to really be, big. They're going to enjoy, it's going to be a meta game, right? It's going to be a meta game of creating games, and they're going to play a big part, both financially and creatively.
Awesome. I've got a lot of positive feedback in comments saying they love your speech, amazing speech. Thank you so much. I want to know, what is your best game, like the game that you enjoy playing the most, if there is one?
Oh, that's
Or
amazing.
is it a
So,
long list?
so there's a number of Web2 classics that we played in my household over the years. Obviously, Civilization is a mega classic. The Age of Empires series, including Age of Mythology, is a RTS super classic, right? Obviously, massively multiplayer super classic like World of Warcraft, and obviously the predecessors like, EverQuest and, these RuneScape and these types of games. But I would say that like the one that's really, really kind of like I've enjoyed, is one called RimWorld, which is an indie game. It's a survival base builder, and it has what's called an AI storyteller. So, if you're a gamer and you're looking for something really strange and something groundbreaking, like definitely check out RimWorld on Steam. It's a really, really strange game. Basically, the way it works is that all of the characters in the game are AIs that are autonomous and do whatever they want. And what you do as the game player is you just basically set rules and priorities, and then they operate within the rules and priorities and do whatever they want. And what emerges are these just amazing stories, right? So it's an AI based story generator, very, very fascinating, and very, very worthwhile in my opinion. But it's very nerdy and it's very indie. So, and the graphics are terrible, but it's super entertaining to me. So like, feel free to check it out.
Love to hear that. Hey, this was a riveting conversation, and thank you for giving us some additional time, to share your wisdom. Really enjoyed having you at our event, and a great way to end. I think the future of Web3 is very, very bright. Our best wishes to you and the rest of your team at Gumi Cryptos Capital, and I hope to run into you in the future again.
Thank you so much. If you want to follow on Twitter/X, it's Miko Java, MikoJava. And, happy, just feel free to reach out. DMs are open. So thank you very much.
I will definitely do that. My best wishes. All right. Take care.